पीछे लक्ष्मण भाई, आगे आगे राम चलत है पीछे लक्ष्मण भाई, आगे आगे राम चलत है पीछे लक्ष्मण भाई.
Many years ago, as a child, I used to sing Ramayana in this Ramla Kuti, which is situated in this beautiful village. This village of Natambua was my home for first 18 years before I moved away to Suva, the capital of Fiji, and then to London. At that time, I was vaguely aware that my ancestors had arrived in Fiji from India, a land far, far away, only to be read on the pages of Ramayana or later on imagined from the scenes of the Bollywood films. Many years later, when I found myself in exile in London, I began searching for my identity. And during that search for my roots, I found out that my grandparents, who just lived across the road from here, were brought to Fiji by the British to work on the sugarcane plantations. From my exile in London and then in Australia, I began researching on Fiji girmitiyas since 1994. Today, 20 years after my exile in London and 30 years after I left this village of Natambua, I once again stand on the grounds of the Ramlila Kuti. It was here that I first learnt of the exile of Lord Rama. Now living in exile myself, I begin a documentary that explores the exile of my grandparents and 35,000 other girmitiyas. Unlike the exile of Lord Rama, who returned home after 14 years, I believed these girmitiyas were permanently exiled here. This here is the National Archives of Fiji, which is located in the Carnarvon Street, Suva. In there contained the immigration passes of the 60,500 girmitiyas. It was here that I met an individual who provided me with information which compelled me to start this research. He asked me whether I had known that about 25,000 girmitiyas had returned to India, and most of them, about 20,000, during the initial period of Girmit. And obviously I was shocked. I had never been informed that so many, about 40% of the initial girmitiyas had returned to India. Dr. Ahmad Ali took me to this, the registers over here, and he showed me something which in a way validated his claim that 25,000 Indians, and especially the early ones, had returned to India. Yeah, as you can see from this register here, page after page, and from the beginning to the end of this register, it's full of red marks and black marks. The red marks, suggest there's people who have gone back to India, and the black marks are people who could not because they died over here. And on each page, it's only a handful of names which doesn't have marks. These are the people who stayed back for whatever reason. And like this, 25,000 girmitiyas have returned. And the question arises is why the remaining 35,000 stayed back.
From the 1850s onwards, there is a large increase in the amount of Australians and New Zealanders and others settling in Fiji. They're planting cotton which because of the civil war in the states and the disruption to the cotton trade.
Much of the land was bought in well below, the value. So land was acquired generally in ways that were not particularly, above board.
When Fiji became a British Crown colony in 1874, it faced a number of problems. The most important of which was that Fiji was reluctantly acquired by the British, and it was required to become self-sustaining in the quickest possible time.
Gordon used a system of indirect governance, which is, in terms of what's available in the public domain. So indirect form of government meant that he looked to indigenous Fijian chiefs, providing administrative support, thereby lowering his administration costs. And Fijian chiefs worked closely with him, especially those who were benefiting from his rule. And these were largely chiefs from the eastern parts of the country. And the net effect of that was that he was also able to deal with them in relation to acquiring land for CSR in the long term. And of course, through the system of indirect government, he was able to maintain a policy where Fijians were basically kept in the villages through regulations and strict enforcement of the regulations.
They're trying to bring laborers from the Pacific Islands and Solomon Islands and Gilberts and so on, but this trade was blood-stained. It was condemned by the missionaries and by humanitarian societies. So there was need for an abundant supply of cheap labor.
To make it a viable colony, the first governor decided that Fiji would benefit from a large company investing in a major sort of plantation and milling operation here. Governor Gordon had experience of Indian indentured laborers in Mauritius and Trinidad, and so he chose to look at Indian labor from India to supply labor. And he persuaded the Colonial Sugar Refining Company of Australia to be the main planters and millers of sugarcane in Fiji.
The CSR company would not have invested in Fiji had it not been for the supply of an Indian labor force.
And Fiji in particular had no experience in recruiting indigenous population into plantation labor, and any attempt to bring them into the plantation system of farming would have disturbed quite a bit in terms of the social structure, the traditional systems.
And when Gordon came to Fiji, he had seen indentured workers in Trinidad and Mauritius.
More important was his experience with indentured laborers from India, and he could figure that out very, very clearly, that labor, that kind of labor would work in Fiji.
So he decided that sugar will be the crop which will drive the economic development of Fiji.
It was absolutely critical to the plantation economy to have an indentured labor force in Fiji.
There is no doubt, about Indian village way of life being disrupted as a result of the new forms of land tenure in India, as well as periodic famines and sufferings of Indian people. Village life had been disrupted. So this disruption led to peasants, agriculturalists leaving the villages in search of employment and livelihoods. But they were in search of employment and livelihoods within India.
Well, basically what happened was you had a protector of immigrants based in Calcutta. Then there was an emigration agent which was shared between Fiji and Guyana and Trinidad because the recruiting seasons differed. And these people had their own arkatis in these districts, who then enticed people sometimes. They told all kinds of tall tales about opportunities in the colonies.
In many instances, they actually told lies to potential immigrants by suggesting that where they were going was very close to Calcutta or to Madras, and that the work was relatively easy, that they earned lots of money compared to what they earn in India. They never talked about task work and about penal sanctions, about being physically punished and abused. These were not part of the information shared.
The Arkati would go to a person who looked lost or was somehow, seemed to be a stranger in a particular place, and he would ask the person, "Bhai, what do you want? Do you want some work?" And the person would say, "Yes, I would like to do some work. Well, I can give you some work."
अच्छा कौन काम रही बहुत उत्साह काम है कल पेड़ के नीचे बैठ के चीनी चले गए अच्छा ये कहाँ पे है कम्मा तो वो नज़दीक है बस कलकत्ता के पास जाके ओ अच्छा ठीक अच्छा तलबवा पैसा तो बहुत मिली एक रोज की 1 शिलिंग कैसे अच्छा चलियो बबुआ चिंता कोई चीज़ की हम तो मिल जाएगा ट्रेन से अच्छा 5 साल लौट के आप तो अपन किसानी अपने करब ना पैसा ऐसा हो जाए अच्छा चलो देखा जाए.
So there is no doubt that there was a degree of enticement present in the system, but that wasn't the only reason why people left.
Like most other sort of areas of historical research, there are different interpretations of what transpired. I follow Hugh Tinker's view, which is that Indian peasants had to be duped into going overseas. With respect to women, a number of scholars point out that the women were the ones who were very difficult to recruit, and in fact they earned a very high premium if the woman was a young and beautiful recruit. Women were very closely protected and even guarded, if you like, in India.
Women were, in fact, very, very critical and crucial to the establishment of the plantation economy. And I found that out through looking at the archives material on the colonial policy with respect to the plantation labor force. So, for example, in the National Archives of Fiji, I found annual immigration reports that basically mathematically calculated the number of women that had to come to Fiji with men on each shipment.
It appeared that many of the women were basically in some ways taken away from their companions and kept overnight, because once they are kept overnight, then this does have implications for how quickly they could be taken back to their sort of household.
Only the young women who had already an agricultural experience and an agricultural background in India were to be recruited for Fiji. And secondly, they had to be young enough to work as wives or to be able to offer themselves as wives or companions to the men who arrived. Because as you know, the indenture labor system was not of old men or children, but of that very productive age group, being from about 16, 17, 18 on to about 30, which is the maximum, because that was the most productive labor force. So that's the reason why they recruited the women.
One of the issues that of course emanate in the discussions about recruitment of women was the allegation that many of the women were, as indentured laborers, were the scum of Calcutta and Mumbai and places like this. Well, that's utter nonsense. Most of them were from village background, of lower and middle order peasant class castes, and most of them were women who worked in agriculture and who happened to be, led astray by the Arkatis.
Some certainly were fraudulently recruited, some were kidnapped perhaps, enticed in different ways.
Bachao! Bachao! Bachao!
And it talks about how the Ferengi, the Europeans, the whites, got hold of these our people and sent them over here, see? Ghir ghir badra savanwa ke hai rama, ghir ghir badra savanwa ke hai rama, kauni nagariya mein basre bidesiya, kauni nagariya mein basre विदेशिया फरिंगियों के रजुआ में छोटा मोरा दिसुआ हो फरिंगिया के रजुआ में छोटा मोरा दिसुआ हो गोरी सरकार चली चाल रे विदेशिया गोरी सरकार चली चाल रे विदेशिया.
What I tried to do in my study was to go beyond those studies that were based on archives and talk to the remaining indentured migrants of the time, and most of these people were elderly people, and the majority of them said that they were tricked.
People were hauled into the nets of the recruiters and initially brought to a local registration place like Faizabad or a major district like that, and from there they were taken to Calcutta, to Garden Reach, where they might stay for up to about a month, and then they would embark for the different destinations.
They were not a people who had confidence in the officials, and therefore they were not about to share their doubts about where they're going, what was happening to them with officials. And so the illiteracy, the lack of confidence would have combined, and the sense of sort of having eaten somebody else's salt would have combined with them basically not taking advantage of this last sort of safeguard to being taken abroad.
It's a very interesting document that describes the embarkation of indentured laborers in 1905, and from that document it's very clear that departing was a very traumatic experience.
There would be long queues of these indentured laborers coming through, and so it was like a conveyor belt treatment rather than a sort of long interview with each one of the potential recruits.
People were crying and uncertain of where they were going. So there was a lot of that kind of emotional trauma involved.
Then the journey itself on the boat. Palke jahujua mein roe dhoe baiti hai, palke jahujua mein roe dhoe baiti mai, kaise hui kala pani par re bidesiya, kaise hui kala pani par re bidesiya. Many of these songs are sung by women, so baiti mai na, from a woman's point of view.
The journey, I asked. His eyes withdrew into himself. The dark waters, the blind winds, the landless sea forever raging. It was Narak. Many died. I survived.
आई घाट देखा जब फिजिया के टपुआ हो, आई घाट देखा जब फिजिया के टपुआ हो, भया मन हमरा उदास रे विदेशिया, भया मन हमरा उदास रे विदेशिया.
Culturally, it was a very chaotic experience because these people come from fairly rigid social units. All of a sudden, those customs and protocols and taboos associated with certain kinds of behavior broke down in the depots, on the ship, and on the plantations. Hard work was not new to these people. It wasn't new to these people. What was new was the relentless pace of work in the absence of a society, of a community.
Because of the kind of diet that they received on the plantations and the kind of work that they had to do, which is back-breaking work, incredibly difficult, and they were not paid as much as men either, because men got 1 shilling for the task that they performed, whereas women got 9p for the task that they performed, and it actually was a task that took a whole day, so the hours were as long as men. So women could find that, that they actually lost their children in the very early years, in the very early months. And there was no child care, and there was no postnatal care. So that, in fact, once you'd given birth, who was actually going to be looking after your children? And you were required to go back into the plantation as quickly as possible after your confinement to continue with your work. Now, that inevitably had an effect on not just children's health, but also women's health as well.
Then the indentured days and nights, when they were here. Kali kothariya mein bite nahi ratiya ho, Kali kothariya mein bite nahi ratiya ho, kisse ke batai hum peer re videsiya, peer is pida, no pain. Kisse ke batai hum peer re videsiya, gir gir badra sawanwa ke hai Rama, gir gir badra sawanwa ke hai Rama, Colonial girmitiyas basere videsiya.
Well, a majority of them, had no communication with their families, relatives, and their home villages. And I think that was a major sort of influence on their lives here.
Amwa ke daliya mein kuhu ke koeliya, Amwa ke daliya mein kuhu ke koeliya, Manwa mein agiya lagaye re videsiya. This is a reminder of back home, no? India is famous for arm.
Some of them, like old elderly people to these, even these days, sort of remember the younger period with fondness, but all of them emphasize the great suffering that they had.
Some of the conditions in which many of these people survived was horrific. There was abject poverty. Many of them survived on the basis of sheer hard work, toiling the land, and making ends meet.
On Sundays I passed through other lines, heard the singing, ancient ballads of brave humanity, the smell of freshly cooked food, the shouts of wrestling and kabaddi, the wailing of women rend the air. Mother India's daughters trapped caged like birds, wing-clipped, mourning. Here we wept and died in the coolie lines of Fiji. Pinjre ke panchi tera dard na jaane koi. Ships without sail, birds without wings, Draupadi without her sari.
Gaya bayal mora khutua pe bhuke rowe, Gaya bayal mora khutua pe bhuke rowe, Akhiyon se asua bahaye re videsiya, Akhiyon se asua bahaye re videsiya. Gir gir badra sawanwa ke hai Rama, Gir gir badra sawanwa ke hai Rama, Colonial nagariya mein ja basere videsiya.
They had work here for 5 years, then they could go back to India, but they had to pay their own passages back. Now that in itself is a prohibitive factor, because if you're only paying people a shilling a day or 9p a day for women, then at the end they have to actually find their own food and so on from that. At the end of 5 years, which person would be able to accumulate sufficient funds to pay for their own passages back? And so the extension of another 5 years to take it up to 10 years, after which your free passage would be paid back for you, was so long a time that it was prohibitive as well, because it meant that at the end of 10 years, very few people actually would be attracted to go back to India because, their family might not be there, or they had, established an alternative family in Fiji. So that in itself was prohibitive.
The system was such that they were lured into staying on, and including CSR company, which gave land to become free settlers, and also government gave some land.
Daughter's Tale. To every 100 men, 40 women, indentured to the CSR company, Terra of Australia, Terra Nullius, an empty line of 24 rooms, 8 feet by 12 feet. Once it housed native workers torn from their villages. 8 died, others fled. Who would live among the dead? This house of hell was now all mine. No sharing of food, the overseer warned. God, what a country where sharing of food was an offense. The clouds seared by lightning, a circle of friends came to listen to my stories. Instead I cooked them a meal. My weekly ration vanished in a single act of hospitality. I forgot to wash the pots. Without food I worked for 3 days. Giddy and sweating, hurricane hunger churning my stomach, I began to hallucinate. My body weak, my throat parched, my stomach ringed with a hollow pain. Bleak, dark, desolate, the night spread its vulture's wings as I contemplated the final act of self-respect. I stood up, tied a rope to the beam, tightened my dhoti. Farewell, I said to Ramlal's Gita. I climbed onto the bed, made a noose. God, tonight I want to dine with the dead. A knocking was heard on the door. Brother, open! Who is it? Are you a ghost? Yes, came the bold reply. 4 men entered my dark hovel. I lit my lamp, there were no ghosts. Bula, they greeted, and sat on the floor. Sam in his broken Hindi said, Brother, give us some food. With tears of shame I replied, I had none. He saw the pot on the chulha, a handful of basi rice they shared. Dane dane pe likha hai khane wale ka naam. They said they were returning from a funeral in Suva, where Joe's brother had died. Joe was in pain. They left him with me, saying, don't sleep. We will be back soon. Outside the light shone from an absent moon. Sam returned with 7 others, carrying bundles of sweet potatoes, yams, vegetables, bananas, tapioca and coconuts. They cleaned the pots, fetched water from the flooding river, boiled the vegetables, offered me the first serve on a fresh plantain leaf, as if they understood my grief. Then they left my friends. More there they yelled in the dark, leaving behind for me an abundance of food, more than I had ever received from the overseers for whom I was bonded to labor for life. Darkness was breaking into another dawn. I prayed to Vishnu. I am the life, spreading life through all. What kept them going was the idea of Rama's exile. Rama was banished on the eve of coronation, and he went for 14 years, but he had a place to return to, Ajodhya. Our people did not get that opportunity.
The Ramcharitmanas was a fundamental text of people on the plantations, not only in Fiji but elsewhere. Why was it so important? It was important because the story of Lord Rama himself, a prince exiled for no fault of his own, but eventually he returned. And there was, for these people, the sense that, one day their ordeal will be over as well. So in that sense, Rama's story resonated in their own experience.
My own understanding of that era is that had it not been for the strength that these people derived from religion, for the Hindus from Ramayana, from Gita and the rest, they would have been totally destroyed. Their morale would have been totally destroyed.
It didn't apply only to Hindus. I think, the people from the whole Indian subcontinent.
Yes, it is for the Muslims, as you will see in the history, that the girmitiyas were supposed to be the illiterate people, but we find that there were some Maulvis and there were some Munshis who hid themselves and came as illiterates, and these are the people who saved the Muslims. Otherwise, there would have been, on the similar side, there would have been no Hindus and there would be no Muslims.
This identity was very important for all of them, and it is one reason why that identity has survived, it's remained intact, despite the onslaught of Christianity attempt to convert Hindus and Muslims to Christianity.
We have served the colonial masters as laborers, and then we would become in the same faith. So we were supposed to be completely docile people.
People always have the attachment, the emotional attachment, the cultural attachment to the countries from where they have come from, where they were born. And there is no doubt that almost all the indentured laborers would have had that emotional, cultural, traditional attachment to India, and many of them would have wanted to go back, considering the conditions in which they were employed in Fiji. So there is no doubt that many of them would have scrambled to actually go back, if they were given an opportunity, given what they experienced during the indenture period while they were in Fiji.
जल्दी करो सीता, वो जावे के बटुआ हमें छोड़ कर ना चला जावे।
चिंता ना करो, ना ही जाई, कोलंबर आश्वासन दिन है ना।
अरे कोलंबरन के क्या भरोसा, उन्हें तो हमें बेवकूफ बना दी। खुश है ना बच्चों, अब बहुत देर नहीं, आजा आजी, नाना नानी सब हैं, इनसे मुलाकात हुई।
चलो भी घर जाकर सब देख ले बे लड़कन।
The colonial government would have got a sense that if these people all go back, then they will have difficulty with the labor supply, and that the sugar industry was going to collapse.
There's no question that the CSR was not keen to see these people return to India, because after having spent so much money bringing them to Fiji, why would you want them to go back after 10 years?
All they wanted was that there was a steady supply of labour for those sugarcane plantations, for them to produce the sugar, to sell to Australia, to make a profit out of. That's all they cared.
No doubt, if more Indians had returned to India, the sugar industry would have faced dire consequences. There would have been a huge, reduction in colonial revenues, and the government would have suffered. There's no question about that.
It was, to me, a orchestrated, managed attempt by the colonial government to actually keep as many indentured laborers who could possibly stay back in Fiji, because they knew that they needed them.
Then you could see the actual logistics of it, you find that they could not go back until after 10 years, that is freely. After 5 years they could go back if they paid their own way.
Seems like that kind of scheme and that kind of policy and the discouragement, whether or not it was written down somewhere as a policy or as a rule, would have resulted in a sort of permanent exile. It would have meant that people would have been firstly discouraged because the window of opportunity to go back to India would have been reduced, and secondly the affordability of that, and thirdly the fact that only those who had been indentured could go back and not their children would have been another prohibitive factor for the families. So I think all of it in combination actually probably prevented people from moving back to India.
Add to that the fact that the ships that were to take them did not come in regularly, and so all these factors acted to basically act as barriers to people returning to India freely.
With the advent of the First World War, shipping is disrupted, and as a result of that, many people who want to return to India are denied the opportunity because of this, this disruption that has taken place.
अभी चलिए अभी बहुत है उधर हम वहीं से जाएगा पहुंच जाइए घरे.
I think it disrupted the flow of people flow of indentured laborers out to India, because if that was the condition, then obviously that would have been difficult.
कुछ समझ में नहीं आवे, बटुआ के कोई खबर नहीं.
लोगन ठीक कह रहीन, कोई वोट नहीं आएंगे.
यही साले कुलम्भरन और सरधारन हमें बेवकूफ बनाए दिन.
तब अब क्या करब हम सब?
गौरवन हमें फंसाए लीन है जिंदगी भर के लिए.
मतलब?
अब जिंदगी भर काटिक पड़ी गिरमिटी नरकवा में, बच्चन के भी. चलो का करियो.
Everyone has concentrated on how much Indians need to feel at home in Fiji. And nobody's really concentrated on the fact that, was there actually a choice given to them to remain in Fiji? And was the choice to return if they wanted to, removed from them? And if it was removed from them, then they would have been devastated at that lack of control over their own lives.
राम राम सरजू भैया, तू ठीक कहीं रही. जो तुम्हारे साथ भे वो हमों के साथ भी सारे भे, हमों फंस गए नी नरकवा में.
राम भैया, चलो अब तुम्हार खातिन घर के बंदोबस्त तो हो ही गवा है. हनुमान के तो 4-5 साल ढकेल दी है जेल में.
जेल में? काहे के?
अरे उस साला कुलम्बर कोई बदमाशी करी सरा, उसके खूब पीटिस. कोई औरत के साथे वैसन कुछ बदमाशी करे रहा.
कुलम्बरन के तो वही काम है, आदमियन के पीटो और जिन के साथ बदमाशी करो.
चलो अब कुछ दिन वही घर में रहियो. का करियो, अब जेल में घर हुआ तो खाली पड़ा है.
See, one of the people that I talked to is an elderly woman who actually cried throughout the interview, and she just was so sort of affected by the memories. But I think people regretted it, and I think many of them basically dug their roots here.
There's no question there was a great deal of anguish, there's a great deal of confusion, there's a great deal of anxiety, You're living in a new land, new friendships have to be formed, families raised and so on.
I think many of them were resigned to the fact that Fiji was now the place where they would have to survive.
राम भैया अब क्या करियो, जिंदगी पड़ा है रोए के, अब लड़कन और सीता भाभी के यहाँ लेकर जाओ।
तुम ठीक कहा भैया, जोन हमारे कलेजा पे जोन बीते हम नहीं मांगते हम लड़कन पे एक आस लगे। Under that stringy tree is buried my woman, who was once as free of blame as Sita in Banvas till Ravana came. Of her 10 children, the first 4 are part of this very earth. In the blind eyeballs, swollen veins, I've carried the Ganges. My sight is dim, my vision clear. What should I fear except your pity? For I can still see in Shiva's jetta Ganga dancing like Parvati. I have lived this exile more gloriously than Rama, and built kingdoms you may find nobler than Ajodhya in my ancient eternal mind. Pity not me then, no mourn for a dying decrepit man. Think of what I was and what you can be, for I only hope your journey from here will be without fear as mine might have been. Then the rain came and cried. Another old man had just died. Oh, my father's fathers, what forgiveness is there for me? Oh, my children's children, listen to the voices of Syria, drowning the silence of the sea.
No one bothered to ask the girmitiyas. They had stories to tell, but we are too busy doing other things. We wanted to move on in this world. So the stories were there. People wanted to tell their stories. There was no one to ask. We are too busy doing other things. We wanted to move on in this world.
1987 shuttered it, and thereafter began the second exile of the descendants of the girmitiyas this time, to countries like Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, UK, you name them.
So, the first 3 coups were all directed against Indo-Fijians and, and directed at letting them know that they don't actually have a place in the islands, that this is not their home, that this is a temporary place, that you are a Bulangi, you are a visitor, that you should, stay within that.
Rambukoa ke deswa me kuhu ke badariya, Rambukoa ke deswa me kuhu ke badariya, अरे कौनी नगरिया में जाए रे कहिंदिया, अरे कौनी नगरिया में जाए रे कहिंदिया, कौनी नगरिया में बसे रे कहिंदिया, कौनी नगरिया में बसे रे कहिंदिया, गिर गिर बदरा सवनवा के हाय रामा, गिर गिर बदरा सवनवा के हाय रामा, कौनी नगरिया में बसे रे विदेशिया.
I see Girmit as a site of inspiring history. To look at the experience of these humble people who began with nothing, and yet, despite all the difficulties, all the impediments they encountered, they made something of themselves. And I think that is a matter, or should be a matter, of great pride to all their descendants.